They didn't have to ask twice. Maybe 20 minutes passed from the moment they arrived to the time James and Cheetah had a room with a bed, freshly covered with new bed sheets ready for them. It would make a dent in their finances, but budget wasn't a big problem currently. They would just have to explain why exactly the payment went towards a brothel. But before any of that would become important, they would have to make sure everything about the deal was finalized. And since this particular line of work, at least here on Dunama, didn't exactly necessitate for its workers to be all too versed in the intergalactic ways, which meant that most, if not all of the girls working here spoke barely, if any, GU, it was mostly up to Sheeda to handle communications between the parties. The girls can do more than just getting screwed, you know. The woman that seemed to be the one in charge for tonight informed her, while they stood aside and watched two other girls clean out another room from anything that would make it unfit to be used as a temporary hotel facsimile. One of them was in the process of throwing out the used bedsheets, while the other one was hurrying in with the new set. I don't need to send them home just yet. They can stay in the main room and wait in case you or your friends need them later. There's no need to be shy about it. The madam was an older Miette in her late Middle Ages that sported the same locally usual complexion as Sheeda did. Combining that with her dialect indicated that she was clearly from around here. Sheeda smacked her lips and felt her tail begin to wave in slight annoyance. Has she not been abundantly clear so far? That won't be necessary, she sighed, and deliberately avoided eye contact with the madam. We're just using this as a room for the night since our accommodations have become temporarily unavailable. No need for anything additional. She could hear the woman grumble in contemplation, although to her credit, she somehow managed to almost make it sound like a purr. And you're sure you don't want to discuss that with your company? She pried further, still trying her best to tickle any bit of business out of this opportunity that had offered itself up during this rather slow time for her occupation. Especially the male one? She'd crossed her arms decisively, and briefly glanced over at her company. James stood a few steps away from the conversation and had returned to exchanging some messages on his phone, something that Tuya had now joined him in, although the cheeky look that the mask on her face projected to the outside world indicated that her conversation was most likely a far cry from the important exchange that James was still taking part in. Meanwhile, the other three, Andrej, Admir and Sam, had all remained at the foot of the stairs and stood huddled together, seemingly discussing something among themselves in a form of sign language that not even Sheeda understood. But that clearly was very optimized for human-like appendages, and therefore clearly didn't help from the larger community. All the while, they were carefully being watched by the rest of the girls, who had also remained downstairs and now used this unusual situation to kill their boredom by talking to each other in hushed tones and quietly giggling every now and then. I'm fully authorized to make that decision for them in this case, she informed the madam, even though she was fully confident that if she asked, none of the humans would jump at the opportunity to get with a mere prostitute tonight. Everyone seemed pretty tired after the events of the day. However, she took another glance at the woman, who seemed to be nothing if not determined to get any bit of money out of this that she possibly could. And admittedly, Sheeda was also tired and not quite in the mood for this discussion, which was why she added, Look, I literally cannot stop you from keeping them here, so do what you like, but you are wasting both their time and goodwill if you do. Satisfied to have, at least supposedly, worn down Sheeda to a point of easier negotiations, the madam's features softened into a happy expression of lifted cheeks, far from the humanish smile that Sheeda had gotten used to in the meantime. I appreciate your worry for my girls, but they also will still get paid for tonight, so there is no harm in keeping them around just a little bit longer, she explained, and lifted her arms in a relaxing manner. I will at least tell them to stay and join you at the table tonight. Maybe while eating together and getting to know them a bit, you will change your minds. Sheeda's gaze twitched towards her and she tilted her head to the side, lifting an ear curiously. We didn't ask for any food, she stated clearly, making sure that her voice left no room to misinterpret what she was saying. The madam released a hoarse chitter and quickly ran an arm across the sleeves of her tight-fitting leather top to smooth out any wrinkles that resulted from each movement of her arms. You didn't have to, she replied in a warm tone that nearly sent a shiver down Sheeda's back with how oddly motherly she was trying to sound. We take care of our customers, especially those who bring a lot of business. It's good for the house, you see, and, service or not, you brought a lot of business. People ready to hire even one girl for a whole night. She gave Sheeda a sly look and suggestively wiggled her ears, adding, And besides, your people look exhausted. Surely they can use a good meal, or maybe a warm drink before going to bed? Some of the girls are very good cooks. Sheeda sighed. Oh well, At least they really seemed to be quite welcome here, even if their visit was slightly unorthodox. However, she doubted that the humans would be very thrilled with the idea of Mia cooking, no matter how good it was by local standards. And that wasn't even mentioning that most of them weren't allowed to take their breath filters off while in the presence of the locals. But then again, most hadn't eaten or even really been drinking anything all day, so maybe they could take something with them to their rooms. She'd pondered for a moment. If so, she said after a moment of contemplation, tell them to only use the meat, no feral bones. Humans don't do well with those. The madam's eyes raised slightly, but the happy look on her face got more certain. I'll see you there, she said, and decided that this was enough pestering the customer for the moment, turning to have something prepared for her guests by one of the many girls whispering and giggling downstairs. They quickly dispersed as they saw their boss approaching. As James noticed the madam walking past him with the widest swing in her step that Sheeta had ever seen, he looked up, ignoring her and glancing over at Sheeta. Putting his phone down for a second, he wandered over to her. Everything worked out? He asked, and for a single curious glance back in the direction of the stairs. Sheeta nodded and brushed some hair away from her face. We're having dinner with them, and afterwards they'll leave us alone, she informed him, and put on the best impish face she could muster despite the uncomfortable feeling in her stomach area, though she insisted on keeping the poor girls in the house. Almost a waste to just have them sit around like this since we're paying for them already. I'd be okay with donating them a night off, but just having them sit downstairs and be bored? James' face went through a variety of emotions, including doubt, amusement, doubt again, incredulousness, some more doubt, and finally suspicion. His eyebrows raised and sunk in a quite impressive display of motion in the process. In the end, he settled on just looking at her with his eyebrows raised as high as he could, while he awaited her explaining herself. And admittedly, after the way her body had been behaving in recent times, she couldn't quite blame him for a little bit of doubt remaining that she wasn't currently trying to get him to invite a bunch of already paid girls to their bed tonight. She wasn't planning to, and not just because she knew that there was no way of ever convincing James of agreeing to it at the time, but she did kind of feel for the girls, given that they must have been struck with the bane just as much as she was currently. Forcing them to stick around here despite there not being even the chance of business was pretty cruel, when they could just as well go home to whoever was waiting for them to find some relief. Not going to force you to get your money's worth, Sheeta playfully conceded, still pretending like that had ever been an option. I was just saying. In the meantime, the girls tasked with getting the rooms ready were seemingly done with the second one, and started to move on to the third, glancing over at the talking pair as they stepped out before exchanging a meaningful look, and moving on with a giggle. After witnessing this, James sighed exasperatedly, but Sheeta giggled along with them. It was a humorous situation. Not long after, the humans and Sheeta had taken a seat at a large table in the brothel's main room. With most of them still wearing their face masks, there wasn't exactly any meal atmosphere coming up around them. However, at least James and Sheeta had decided that it would be polite to at least start to eat at the table, before everyone would turn into their rooms so they could remove their breath filters, at least momentarily, without repercussions. In the meantime, they had also worked out who would be sharing a room with who. Obviously, James and Sheeta were sharing a bed, but the other pairings had surprised Sheeta slightly more, as it seemed that Sam and Andrej would be joining each other for the night, while another room would be occupied by Admir and Tuya, leaving their pilot to get a bed for himself. Sheeta wasn't sure if she understood or should ask why they had decided to split like that, since she had expected them to split up based on genders, but in the end it wasn't all that important. I hope you aren't discussing any critical information in a setting like this, the Major subtly admonished someone loudly, yet clearly jokingly over the entire table, while plates and mugs with steaming liquid were still being set down before them. Sheeta quickly glanced over to see that he had playfully raised his finger to point at Tuya, who was still busying herself with her phone, as there was nothing better to do currently. Of course not, sir, Tuya replied in a sarcastic tone that she likely could not have afforded to put on with any of her superiors that weren't currently sitting at this table, and although the display of her mask did not convey as much, Sheeta still had a feeling that the woman may have stuck her tongue out at Andrej. However, while she was busy reacting annoyedly, a shade suddenly appeared behind her and peeked over her shoulder, as if trying to prove the Major's point. What you looking at there? The nosy girl asked, with one of the thickest farmland accents Sheeta had ever heard in a place like this one, clearly either unaware or uncaring that the human would very obviously not be able to understand her. Surprisingly, Tuya's head shot up while she quickly hid her phone onto the table, before she turned towards the girl with her mask displaying a very much displeased expression. "Do you mind?" she asked firmly, being understood just as little as she had understood the girl in the process. However, the girl just giggled and put on a suggestive expression, wiggling ears and all. "Looking like you need to be good with your hands to work on stuff like that," she said right in the face, completely ignoring how annoyed Tuya clearly was at her. "If you're getting lonely tonight, I'm your girl." After she had gotten that out, she finally backed off and started walking around the table to take a seat on the side opposite to the humans, along with most of her colleagues. The girls were all dressed pretty much the same, at least from what you could see on the outside. Plain leather jackets, closed up to the top button, and unrevealing leather pants. Some of Shida's human company had been quite surprised at the girls' friend being quite so plainly dressed, as most women you saw walking around the streets of Dunama wore more revealing clothes in their day-to-day lives, including Shida, whenever she wasn't put into her uniform. But to Shida it was quite natural. After all, in a place like this, getting to take the clothes off was half the fun of it all. Now the girls sat there, waiting anticipatingly for what the humans would do next. Clearly, at least, some of them were expecting their visitors to finally take their masks off, so they could get a better look at what they seemingly still perceived to be possible customers. Shida had to pull her attention away from the girls, as one after the other started to notice her staring at them, and so she quickly distracted herself with the only thing that came to mind. "What the hell were you looking at there?" she asked Tuya, as the only one who had understood both sides of that mutually one-sided conversation. The projection of Tuya's face turned from annoyed to incredulous, and it almost seemed like she was wondering, A, what that girl had said in reaction to whatever she had been looking at there, and B, how anyone could possibly reach the conclusion of whatever she thought the girl said, based on the things she so quickly hid under the table. However, just like the last time Shida had asked her something like this, Tuya didn't hesitate long, before pulling her phone up from under the table and showing a screen of the Shida. On there, nestled in between a bunch of not that interesting text messages, was a comparatively large picture of what seemed to be some sort of machine, and despite Shida being quite sure that she hadn't really gotten into contact with something like this, it looked oddly familiar to her. Since it was presented so openly, James also took a look at it, and he slightly raised his eyebrows but didn't say anything on the matter. Instead, seemingly lost in thought and without really thinking what he was doing, he lifted the mug that had been placed next to him and casually took a sip of the hot liquid. Immediately, his face scrunched up strongly, and he quickly put the mug back down with a loud clink, just so he wouldn't drop it while he tried to fight the urge to immediately spit out whatever he had put in his mouth there. A battle that he finally lost, being forced to grab a napkin that had thankfully been offered to him, eventually to subtly rid himself of the offending liquid. Clearly still quite offended by the unexpected taste that lingered in his mouth, he looked down at the mug again, even leaning towards it to take a whiff of what the content smelled like. "What is this stuff?" he mumbled to himself, which Shida took as an invitation to reach around him to pull the mug towards her, to see if she could identify the drink inside. And, while she was at it, she also quickly stole a piece of meat from James's plate, just for good measure. Briefly, she saw James twitching into his typical motion of stopping her from taking his food, before the realization apparently set in that she would be absolutely fine eating anything offered to her by other Miats substance-wise, and he didn't need to worry. Therefore, he settled down again, wordlessly allowing her to steal his food all she wanted, which was almost disappointing. Still, just as he had done, Shida quickly smelled the liquid, and almost immediately she felt herself invigorated, as the rich, flavourful smell with an added note of mint filled her nose and lungs, seemingly spreading through her entire body instantly. The breath she took got longer and longer, as she sucked in more and more of the fine-smelling steam, until she finally let it all out in a long, satisfied exhale. "Fries cooked broth," she then finally replied to James's question, before putting her lips onto the cup and taking a very small sip of the hot liquid, feeling the taste of water and meat, but also again that strange, minty note wash over her tongue before it gently glided down her throat. And it spiked. While James was busy raising an eyebrow at that comment, Shida looked over at her fellow felines on the other side of the table. "Naughty girls," she playfully admonished them in the language they would understand, while waving the cup around, before breaking into a brief giggle. "A nice try. Too bad for you that it wouldn't work on humans, even if they did like the taste." However, while the girls reacted with the same giggle Shida was putting on, the humans had gotten quite quiet. "What did they put in there?" Sam finally asked, while looking at the cup at her own side suspiciously. Immediately it became somewhat clear that even after the comparatively long time she had spent among them, there were still things about the humans that Sheeta hadn't discovered yet, and apparently this was one of them. Seemed humans didn't exactly like the sound of having their drink spiked. Immediately she snapped out of the good mood the drink had put her into, and lifted her hands calmingly. "Relax," she said. "The meat was just cooked with some nivas, nothing dangerous." She felt like that last part should have been easy enough to read from her reaction alone, but just to be safe she still specified it. "It's not very concentrated and only done to put people in a good mood around here," she explained further, and took another quick sip from the cup to signify that she really wasn't considering it to be any sort of threat. Then, with a quick glance over at the girl, she added, "You just usually had to ask for that sort of treatment." The human seemed to relax at her explanation, although a certain bit of tenseness remained. "Well, I think I'll stick to water," Admick commented with a chuckle to break the tension a little. "I'd recommend that," James replied, the look on his face still telling of a lingering taste he didn't enjoy. However, the pieces of meat, even though they must have been rather bland for a human's general taste, since Miat weren't exactly using a lot of condiments in their cooking, found a bit more agreement. However, with the mood now thoroughly ruined for the humans by the Miat's little attempt to possibly entice some action tonight, they quickly started to move to take their food along to their rooms, but they could finally eat and drink in peace before turning in for the night. James and Sheeta still finished their meal at the table. However, they didn't get into any more exploits with the brothel's workers, and so time flew by before they also closed their door to their room for the night. James almost immediately began with the process of trying to make himself comfortable, despite not having any of his necessary luggage for that with him, while Sheeta looked around the room, becoming a bit nostalgic at a number of items that were present, for either the girls or the customers' convenience, that she hadn't seen in a very long time while she was off-planet. Round, fibrous clawed utensils, a large backstretcher that looked like a miniature bridge made of padded wood, heated hard seats, and more miscellaneous items that weren't exactly necessary, but that she remembered missing back when she had first left Dunamur. Back then, she didn't have the necessary funds to take things like these with her when she left, and later she never came back for them. So far, she hadn't even thought about it, but now she wondered if she should maybe stock up on things like this while she still could, as she slowly sank the claws of her right hand into one of the detensors, pressing them strongly into the tough yet easily penetrable material, and feeling as the tension she didn't even know she had anymore was taken out of them, the more she stretched them with the help of the item. The feeling was so good that it, combined with the mood boost she had already gotten from the Mivaz-infused drink earlier, that she in hindsight maybe shouldn't have consumed while on duty, was enough to make her start to purr slightly. Despite the unfortunate and frankly infuriating circumstances that had led to it, this still shaped out to be a somewhat enjoyable evening. Just as she thought that, there was suddenly a knock on the door. However, the person knocking seemingly had forgotten what a knock was meant for exactly, as they immediately opened the door and came in without waiting for as much as an answer. It was one of the girls, supposedly the one generally using this room for her work if Sheeta had to guess, and she walked right in on Sheeta sinking her claws into the detensor, and James standing with his pants down as he had gotten ready to go to bed. The girl, very clearly used to much worse than that, didn't really react to the scene, apart from her eyes quickly shooting between the very obvious bandaged wound on James's leg and Sheeta's face. She also smiled as James half-heartedly attempted to hide himself behind the frame of the bed, clearly forgetting for a moment in what kind of establishment he was. Around here, there was really no use to being coy. As no one said anything, the girl stepped further into the room, and now Sheeta noticed that she was carrying a large bottle in both hands. With purposeful steps, she walked directly over to James, holding out the bottle to him expectantly, which led him to look at it with a confused expression. "The lady of the house wants you to have this," the girl clarified, though it was unhelpfully in the wrong language. Not bothering with a translation, Sheeta pulled her claws out of the ball and walked over towards the two, and she got to observe as James tried to politely hide his mechanical arm behind his back, while the girl nosily tried to see why he was trying to hide his arm in a quite fascinating display, although James was at the disadvantage since his body refused to bend and twist to anywhere near the degree the girl was able to contort hers in her attempts to look around him. "Lady of the house?" Sheeta finally asked, relieving James from the power struggle as the speaking up caused the girl to turn her body back into a more human posture as she looked over at her. It was an odd way to phrase it, and also, if the madam wanted them to have something, why wouldn't she have mentioned it earlier? But before the girl could elaborate, James's phone, which he had set down on a small nightstand while he got undressed, suddenly started to ring, startling everyone in the room. Hello, Mr. Orwin. Vezelon's clear voice came out of the phone's speakers, after James had picked it up from the nightstand. Enjoying your stay? James' face darkened, and he felt himself freeze up at the words. What the hell? Why were they calling him? Did they know where he was? Hell, had they something to do with that bottle? No. That was ridiculous. At least that last part had to be a coincidence. Or did it? A bad feeling started to spread throughout his gut. Have you been spying after me? He asked. Serious enough to bring across that he did not appreciate even having to ask such a thing, but with enough lightness to his voice that he could play it off in case this really was just a coincidence. Vezelon replied in a strange tone, surprised and defensive at the same time, but not defensive in a way that made it seem like they had to actually defend themselves. More like they had just been confronted with an understandable yet wrong accusation, and needed to quickly clear it up. Of course not, they said hastily, showing maybe the most emotion James had yet heard out of them. That would be highly unprofessional. Of course I didn't spy after you. They paused, and if James had to guess, they were trying to carefully pick their next words, which made him think there was a but coming. However, they continued, almost fulfilling his prophecy, I couldn't help but notice when you arrived in one of our buildings. The main room is equipped with cameras, and you and your group are quite hard to overlook or mistake for anyone else. I don't know what brought you to our establishment after our earlier meeting. However, I felt it would be fitting to send you a sort of housewarming gift, given our future cooperation. James found himself struck with silence for a moment, as he stared down at the bottle. In the meantime, Sheeta walked up to him from his side. Who is it? She whispered quietly, while the girl was left holding out the bottle without understanding what was going on. Vezelon, James replied harshly. They've sent the bottle. He was still debating whether he should believe them on the whole not spying on him part. They did sound quite genuine when they denied it, but that could have just been clever acting. And was he really supposed to believe they had that close of an eye on every establishment the Zishidi Comaltopeno owned, that they noticed his group entering one of them? Well, admittedly, maybe they had been contacted about it. But still, he leaned towards a healthy distrust of their claims. Vezelon is the lady of the house? She'd asked, sounding honestly surprised, her ears standing up, both as an expression of that, and in a clear attempt to hear both sides of the conversation. James didn't understand the question, however. Vezelon immediately laughed at that. Of course not, they replied happily to the question, not addressed towards them. I merely sent it in Zishidi's name. Now it was James's turn to look surprised, so much so that he forgot his suspicions for just a second, as he removed the phone from his ear to look at it, as if that would tell him if he had heard them right or not. Then Zishidi is the lady of the house? James asked unbelievingly. Vezelon giggled again. It's just a title, they explained calmingly. Don't put too much stock into the exact phrasing. James glanced over at Sheeta, who simply shrugged her shoulders, indicating that this might not be a local thing he just wasn't understanding. But then he suddenly remembered that he was supposed to be suspicious, and most likely just a little bit angry. Well, anyway, we don't need any of your gifts, he said, returning to his previous sternness immediately. We didn't choose this place because it belongs to Zishidi, but because it was the closest, and any cooperation we might have in the future is still entirely undecided, so I think the appropriate thing would be to just treat us like any other customer. We pay for the night, we will stay for the night, that's it. Vezelon was quiet for some time. Yes, I think you're correct, they finally said. Forgive me for intruding like this. It seems I got a little carried away. Would you let me talk to my courier for a moment? James huffed. However, although reluctantly, he momentarily put the phone on speaker, holding it out flatly. She can hear you, he informed his mysterious acquaintance loudly. What followed was a brief conversation that James didn't understand, although he was sure Sheeta was listening carefully for anything that might be out of the ordinary. At the very least, the talk had the desired effect of making the girl pull the large bottle close to herself again, before mumbling some words that were most likely a form of goodbye or excuse, before quickly striding out of the room, keeping their provocative swing in her step up even as she hurried to leave. You will not be unnecessarily disturbed again, Vezelon then informed, understandable once more. Again, please forgive my intrusion. James clenched his teeth together hard for a second, feeling a wave of anger bubble up from deep within him as he reminded himself once again why they were even in this situation. However, he managed to fight it back, putting great effort into smoothing out his emotions once more. You are forgiven for the intrusion, he said at first in a very calm, matter-of-fact way. However, then he shifted his voice into a more authoritative one, as he added, And Vezelon, we need to have a talk. Not now, not tonight, but soon. And if you know what is good for you and your employer, you should better be more than ready to answer for yourself. His voice carried only the slightest ember of the fire within, but at least before his inner eye, it was still enough to ignite the air. There was no quarter in it, no goodwill, only certainty. Avesalon remained quiet for some time. It felt like they were steeling themselves or something. "I understand," was what they ultimately replied, and it seemed to be both an answer to James's statement and a statement of their own, like they had just solved a puzzle that had previously been troubling them. "Good night, Ambassador." "Good night, Avesalon," James replied. Then the connection cut, and James released a long breath, imagining plumes of smoke coming out of his mouth, just for the sake of it. "What was that about?" Sheila asked as soon as he was done, stepping up closer again to also take a look at his phone, as if that was going to tell her anything. "No idea," James replied, before switching through some menus to open a new application in order to send everyone a message to be on the very close lookout for any bugs that may have been planted on them. "But we're going to have to go through our stuff for a moment." However, no matter how carefully they searched and sifted through everything with the finest mesh, there was nothing. No camera, no microphone, not even a chip of any sort could be found. It seemed that, if Avesalon had been spying on them, they at least weren't doing it using any sort of bug. They also didn't find any sort of hidden camera in this room specifically, which was a relief in more than one way. James also noticed that Sheila seemed to be getting both tired and angsty, slowly but surely, the longer he kept at it, and therefore he decided that, with everyone now informed about the situation and their bases covered when it came to surveillance, it was time to let it rest for this one night.